This is the Dane Moore NBA podcast brought to you by Prize Picks, coming at you Wednesday morning. It's February 7th, and it was another late game, blown lead by the Wolves that we have to discuss here on today's show. I got Chris Hine from the Star Tribune here with me in Chicago. Chris, it's February 7th. Since January 7th, the Wolves have lost 7 games in which they held leads. In Dallas, on January 7th, they had a 6-point lead and went on to lose by 7. In Boston, they had a 9-point lead and went on to lose by 7. Against Oklahoma City, they had a 12-point lead, went on to lose by 6. Starts getting worse. Against Charlotte, they had an 18-point lead, went on to lose by 3. Yep. Against San Antonio, 15-point lead in the fourth quarter, went on to lose by 1. Against Orlando, they had a 17-point lead, went on to lose by 2. And then last night against Chicago, they had a 22-point halftime lead. The lead was as big as 23, and they went on to lose this one in overtime. As I saw Sam Quinn point out on Twitter, the sum of those deficits in those 10 games that they have blown equals 100 exactly. That's obviously not what you want. Chris, in your questions to Finch and the players in the locker room last night, you had one pretty clear theme to your questions, which were, is there a theme and a trend to these losses that they can point to?
It's a very Kurt Hapley way of explaining it. The theme is, what is the theme?
What answers, I guess, from that stood out to you? I have the Finch clip one. I don't have any clips from any of the players or anything, but what stood out to you from the themes that they brought up to us?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we can see is, and I think it might have been Rudy who was talking about this, is they play well, they get the big lead, and then it's just like, okay, well, we don't have to play as focused on offense. Maybe, just guys start trying a few things. The ball stops moving. It gets more ISO heavy, ISO happy. And then that leads into their defense as well, which tends to lag. And I think that's what I've noticed. And I think, that was kind of confirmed last night. To me, I actually, in my gamer today, I kind of compared it to the Atlanta game.
Yep.
And they had all the trappings of that Atlanta game from earlier in the season, which it seemed like they had learned from after it happened, and now they're repeating the same mistakes. Offense played great in that game, big first half lead. Second half, somebody gets hot. DeJounte Murray got hot in that particular game. Coby White gets hot in this one. Offense dies, defense is affected by that, also dies. And then all of a sudden, it's like you can't stop the avalanche coming downhill. That's to me is like the biggest difference, where it's like they seem to learn from that Atlanta game. They seem resolved not to want to have that happen again. And so for 2 months, they were pretty good at that. And now the last month, it's been, no lead is safe with this team. And they haven't relearn that lesson. You would have thought games like Charlotte and San Antonio maybe would have sent a message, but instead they've just dropped 2 more just like it after they've built even larger leads.
Yeah, it's fair to say I think the trend is getting worse. I mean, if we just go through those numbers, the numbers of the leads get bigger that they have blown over time, which I think to some extent signals a little bit of a phobia of that as it's going. They pretty clearly, came out of the third quarter in neutral. And then I think it was like 3-4 minutes into the third quarter, and that 22-point lead is down to like 10. Yep. And then that kind of fear, agita, whatever, seems to kick in some. It triggers a sense of urgency, but not necessarily in a positive way. It I don't know. It kind of triggers the urgent worst tendencies of this team in a lot of ways. And I don't think this is an issue completely to subscribe to the young guys on the roster I think particularly in last night's game, and particularly in the first half, I thought Ant and Jaden, they played great in the first half in particular, but they have been part of the trend here of blowing these leads, and part of that is it's somewhat understandable in the idea that they're 22 and 23 years old for the Sunday paper. So before this Bulls game, you wrote about that, particularly with Jaden McDaniels and Anthony Edwards in this role they've kind of been thrust into, given this team has been microwaved through the Gobert trade into a really good team in the Western Conference, but also throwing those two into really major roles that require, it always seems like pejorative to say like maturity. I don't see Ant or Jaden to be like immature people necessarily, but some immature behavior on the court, wavering effort levels, wavering execution, all those sort of things. And your point was, this was the risk of the Gobert trade was, tucked behind all the draft picks. And we were talking about, that's a lot to give up for Gobert. We did all acknowledge this is going to make, even last season before, we're like, this is going to make the Wolves a good team. And when we talked to Conley and Finch, they were like, it's going to be really valuable to have Edwards and McDaniels playing in competitive basketball very early in their career, playoffs year after year. That was, part of the motivation of the Gobert trade. But so as to be able to
get to that point,
to have the chance to prove it in the playoffs, Ant and Jaden are such a big part of that. And again, I'm not hyper focusing on them in particular in the Bulls game, because I think that was a sort of a team-wide thing. I think just broadly, this blown lead was a little bit different than the Charlotte to San Antonio and some of the other ones. Yeah. But I'd like to talk a little bit about that concept of thrusting Edwards and McDaniels into this role at such a young age that they're really counted on, so as to be able to deliver. I guess I know what inspired that story, but what was sort of the thought process going into that?
So the thing that I've learned the most about covering the NBA in 6 seasons, and I guess this applies to professional sports at large, is to be good and to be clutch. The key is consistency. The key to being a good NBA player or a great NBA player is how often can you reach the top of your potential or play well on a night in, night out basis. It's not reaching like superstar heights one night and then, lagging for the next 3 or 4 games. The key to being successful in the NBA is, can you be really good every night? And so young players do not do that in the NBA. Yeah. And especially in late game situations, the key to late game situations to me is also consistency, in that you just do what you do normally. Yeah. And that's the key to being a clutch NBA player. Reach those levels that you're capable of on a consistent basis. So for every time you have a game like Oklahoma City, where the win on the road, where late game situations, Anthony Edwards' decision making looks great. Jaden McDaniels hits a big 3, tips in a bucket. That was like the antithesis to everything that's gone on the last month. But
should be acknowledged, right? These guys have not been zeros in this. It's not like, but it's like
you ask yourself, it's like, why can't that be more the norm? And it's just because it's youth and it's inexperience and it's still being relatively young in the NBA universe and not having enough muscle memory for what to do all the time in late game situations. You could say, well, hasn't it been like 2 seasons of this? And yes, it has, or 3 seasons if you want to go back pre-Gobert. But one of the things I put in my piece is that, especially as it relates to Ant being the leading scorer and the main person with the ball in their hands in clutch time, this doesn't happen where some of these star players don't get to the finals at 22 years old. They don't, deep playoff runs when your leading scorer is 22 is not a thing that really happens in the NBA. It's more the exception than the rule. And in recent years, you've had to have been at least 24, like Devin Booker and Jason Tatum were 24 when they led the Suns and the Celtics to finals appearances. So I think you just have to look at the age curve of the NBA, how long it takes for young players to really develop what to do in high pressure emotional situations in a game. And I think what the Orlando game displayed was that Ant and Jaden have a lot to still overcome and learn. Ant picks up a technical in a tie game with less than 7 minutes left, and then Jaden committed, a third foul in a late game situation. If you go back to that Brooklyn game, San Antonio, and then Orlando, kind of his third foul in a late game situation that proved huge. So again, you could say they should learn by now, they should know by now, but some of it is also just the natural maturation of being young players. In the NBA, it takes time. I know people don't want to hear that, but that's what I've learned in 6 years of covering this league. It does take time for young players to mature, and it takes multiple years. And unfortunately, the trade put that burden on them very quickly. Now, it should benefit them in the long run. By the time they hit 27-ish years old and reach the peak of their careers, you hope to have some of that stuff figured out. But for right now, with this team, they're still going to have growing pains because you're counting so much on these two guys, one being so important offensively and the other being so important defensively.
Yeah, it's just as humans, right? Being younger, it sticks out because I remember this was in, Finch's answer. I just listened to it, is the consistency of focus and intensity. That it's rare, very rare, that a 22-year-old player will bring that, night to night in the league. It's more common in somebody who's 36 years old, like Mike Conley. I think Gobert is very good at that at 31 years old, but that's, almost a decade plus in Mike's case of experience on those guys. And, and Rudy's almost 10 years older than both of them too. But I think that's what it is. I think that's where the youth shows up, is in, yes, that there's execution issues, but it's also the focus and intensity. And I'll play that clip from Finch when you ask what the themes are here in these losses.
Kind of going back a few weeks now, there's the Charlotte game, San Antonio, Orlando, kind of high double-digit leads that have disappeared. Have you noticed a theme in these games?
It has to be focus. It has to be focus and intensity as much as execution. You play well, you get up, and then I don't know. It's a question for the guys, but our seriousness has to maintain a high level. Just because we're up doesn't mean that the other team's going to go away. And just the turnovers and the threes, the turnovers in the transition, and the turnovers in the offensive rebounds. It's just too many bites at the cherry for them.
So Chris, I think connecting McDaniels and Edwards there to Finch, or the whole team to Finch, I think the question is like, what can Finch do to be able to manage this? Is there anything he can do? And there are some things. Could you bench Jaden McDaniels at the end of games, Anthony Edwards? Could you go with different closing lineups from time to time? Obviously, one thing Finch has talked about is just putting the ball in Mike Conley's hands a little bit more than Anthony Edwards in those spots. What do you make of that whole sort of like idea of what Finch can do here, when we acknowledge that part of this is just the fact that they're young and they can't consistently do it right now? How do you go about managing that as a coach when, if it's tomorrow in Milwaukee and you're in this situation again, do you just roll it out again and hope it's better? Like, are there, or should there even be changes that he needs to make in these spots?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the magic answer is. I don't think benching Anthony Edwards in late game situations is the answer, because the offense just is a different thing when he's not on the floor. I did notice, I think I want to say maybe about 3 minutes to go, kind of right before it got like to the final possessions of regulation, but it's still kind of crunch time. There were like 2 or 3 possessions in a row where Ant didn't touch the ball.
Yeah.
And they were running stuff for Carl to try and get Carl some open looks or a look in the post. And eventually it paid off because he had like there were only 2 buckets down the stretch. He had the 3 and he had the post up.
But I think he did miss 3 other
3. He also missed a couple. Yeah, exactly.
No, it's a good distinction.
Maybe we saw a little bit of that where it was like, I mean, it's tough to say Ant shouldn't touch the ball on a possession like that, but it's like, okay, we're just gonna work through Carl here for this possession and see what happens. We like the matchup with Carl, try to get him a look instead of always having it in Ant's hands. Look, some of the stuff with Ant, they ask so much of him throughout the course of a game, right? That is a lot of bandwidth that Anthony Edwards is eating up in the course of a game. It's a lot of mental energy. It's a lot of physical energy, right?
Yeah.
And, it plays into, I think, the moments of lack of focus that you might see out of him because they are just asking him to carry so much of the burden offensively. It's a lot to handle.
Yeah.
And I think maybe alleviating some of that in late game situations, not always having him have the ball in his hands on every single possession, always relying on him to make the right decision, is one way to take a little bit of that pressure off of him and work a little more through Carl like they did last night. Now it ended up in a loss, but
it's the process, right?
Right.
I think they call the timeout at 5:19. Mike Conley checks back into the game then, and so it's starters to close the game, and it's a timeout. So they have a specific action drawn up out of the timeout. It's a pick and pop between Conley and Towns. Towns hits that 3, and then I think it was 3 more threes that Carl missed in those the final 5 minutes of that. And the reason Carl was able to get those looks was Ant not be domineering with the ball,
right,
and kind of doing what we've talked about him needing to do. And it just kind of sucks because I think that's probably the right process. But if Carl hits one of those 3 threes where he was shooting almost shot 50% from 3 in the game, what does that change? Like, do they probably win the game if they just hit one more of those threes in crunch time? So it's a difficult thing where we probably need to look at like process versus results. But when you're already in a trend of this, it becomes more results focused, right? This is another time we did it. And, when we talked to Ant after the game, it was just he was a little befuddled. And, I asked him, does this feel like it's something that you guys are close to overcoming and putting in the past? And he's like, oh, what were we up 18-23? Like, no, we're not close. We're not close if this is continuing to happen. And yeah, there's 31 games left in the season, but there's time, but there's not a ton of time for them to be able to resolve this going forward. It's it kind of is, I think, the situation where as much as you can, you need to focus on the process and not the results. But I understand that being hard for the players to do, hard for Finch to do, hard for fans to hear. But the most important thing to resolve this issue is to have as good of a process for late game offense as you can, right? I don't really know what the other answer there would be.
Yeah, I didn't really have too much of an issue with kind of what they got, and Carl had it going from 3, like you said. To me, like how they were operating late game offense was a little bit more down on the list of issues. I mean, the overtime was bad because they had 4 turnovers in a 5-minute quarter. Overtime was bad. Down the stretch of the 4th, I thought it was okay. It was more everything that preceded it in the 3rd quarter and early in the 4th. That was more the issue last night.
And Finch said this one was more about the defense,
Yeah.
and not the offense and late game execution, and that is important to distinguish. We can't just, as I led this with, lumping all 7 losses into the same pile. There's distinctions to be made.
Everything has its own flavor. Each loss was different.
We could do 45 minutes right now where we do 8 minutes on each of those games explaining what happened uniquely in that one. The thing though in this one, and what I want to dig into a little bit more once we take a break, is the defense here, and why that kind of fell apart in this game. But first we'll take our first break. And today's show is brought to you by Falling Knife Brewing Company, and I'm excited to share that we are going to be doing a live show on February 22nd. That's the last day of All-Star break. The Wolves return to play on February 23rd, I believe, against Milwaukee, and myself and Britt Robson will be doing a live show at Falling Knife Brewing Company on that Thursday. Come at 6:00. We're gonna kind of do like a happy hour meet and greet sort of thing there. Get a spot. It's not a huge tap room, so when we've done these before, it's kind of filled out. So I'd recommend getting there at 6:00, and then Britt and I, as we have many other times, we'll do a live show from kind of 7 to 8 p.m. and we'll take listener questions and we'll hang out a little bit after that. So put down February 22nd on your calendar for Falling Knife Brewing Company, and also if you just want to go check out Falling Knife. Obviously, for any of these games, they're showing them. And they also wanted me to let you know that they now have THC beverages. So they are adding to their deep beer bag with some THC options there as well. So always be checking out Falling Knife if you're looking for a brewery in Minneapolis. And then, Chris, quickly, this is my plan for the Super Bowl, is I am going to get one Super Bowl-related pick from each of you, Jace, Kyle, and myself, and that is going to be our slate. Jace's was Brock Purdy throws an interception, which I know might hurt your feelings or something. But what do you? I don't
disagree. Well, obviously, I'm rooting for the Niners, but it's so hard to pick against Patrick Mahomes.
So he's a free square for Prize Picks. It's more or less than half a passing yard. So that one will be in ours. Jace put in the Purdy interception.
I feel pretty confident about over 0.5 passing yards for Patrick.
You like that one?
I like that one. That's a good pick. What else we got here? It's hard for me to see the screen.
Well, I mean, is there just like a matchup wise in this, or like do you like Ayuk in particular, or just from, I know you've been thinking about this.
Kittle, I have. What's Pacheco at rushing yards wise?
That was 67.5 rushing yards.
I'd go over on that.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I think he goes. The Niners' run defense has been what is susceptible. Mm-hmm. They allowed Aaron Jones to have a big game. Gibbs and Montgomery had big games before the Lions stupidly abandoned trying to run the ball in the second half.
Yeah.
So I think Pacheco will go over 67 rushing yards. I feel pretty confident in that.
All right. We will continue building this out.
I think if you go back on recent weeks, I think I've done terribly on these. So please do not take my advice when it comes to these picks.
It's just meant to, to lay it out there. Everyone, you can go make your own Prize Pick slate for the Super Bowl. I know many of you already have Prize Picks accounts, but if you do, want to do something, have something on the line in the Super Bowl, Prize Picks is a fun way to do it. Put $5 down to, get 4 picks and, get 10 to 1 or something on your money. It's a fun way to do that. And that's prizepicks.com or the Prize Picks app. They will do a $100 sign-up bonus if you use the promo code Dane, and they are giving that Mahomes free square. So I think a fun way to be able to, have something on the Super Bowl here. All right, Chris, let's continue talking about this Bulls game, this theme of late game whatever. And it's turning into late game whatever because defense was a factor against the Bulls last night. And I think it was actually a factor against Orlando last week as well. I think it's a bigger thing that, just asking some of the players last night in the locker room about teams going bigger to match them.
Yeah.
Orlando went really big. We talked about that in that game. They played 4 6'10" guys to close the game, and Jalen Suggs. And then last night, Chicago starts Andre Drummond and Nikola Vucevic in that game, which I honestly kind of came into it being like, well, I don't know. Like, that puts Vucevic on Karl. Like, this should lead to Karl having a big game. I get the idea of wanting to go big against the Wolves to kind of match them, but I didn't think that was a great strategy given that Karl still has an advantage on Vucevic, and that played out in the first half, right? Karl has a really big first half there, but the issue was in this game defensively was the presence, I thought, of Andre Drummond, who was really a force on the offensive glass, which in and of itself is an issue, right? Like, you give up what did Drummond have? 5 or 6?
I have it in front of me here. Drummond had
6. Yeah.
He had 6 offensive rebounds.
16 total boards, 6. And honestly, like, maybe 3 or 4 more where he like tapped it around. And like he got his hands on more than 6 missed shots last night. And the trickle-down effect of that, right, is now Rudy needs to stay home a little bit more on Drummond so as to be boxing him out and doing that. And, a foundational tent pole of this Wolves defense is Gobert and help, right? That's the idea behind always trying to put him on the non-shooters and lurk, and as they do, and it works great. But Rudy could not help as much in this game because he had to stay somewhat attached to Drummond, and or someone had to help him out, boxing out Drummond when he did go to help. And that consistently did not happen last night. And I don't know. I think this will become somewhat of a trend going forward. I think teams will, not every team has a lineup that they can go to that is bigger and more physical, right. But I do think teams that can do it, even stretching to do something that I don't think Drummond and Vucevic, I don't know, maybe they have. They don't typically start games for the Bulls. So I say that to mean I think teams are going to, there's more of a scout out there on the Wolves. There's more of there's 50 games you can look back at what's beat them, what gives them problems. I think this is a way of attacking the Wolves defense in particular, is playing with some more size, and in the process of doing that, kind of neutralizing some of Gobert's defensive impact. And I do feel like a lot of Gobert's defensive impact was limited in that game last night. What stood out to you about the Gobert against the bigs and Drummond in particular?
Yeah, like you said, he couldn't really help as much as he wanted to. And I think what going big against the Wolves does is, and I've thought a little bit about this in the wake of last night's game, the Wolves have been a better rebounding team this season overall, right? And if you go small against the Wolves, you are taking away your ability to offensive rebound against them, right? But by going big, you maybe take advantage of the fact that they generally have been a poor rebounding team.
True.
Going back to last season. So if you have the capability to maybe grab a couple more boards on the offensive glass, that's one way you can offset some of the Wolves' half-court defense. We always say we like the Wolves' half-court defense if they can, and especially if they could just limit opponents to one shot. Where you get them is on the margins in terms of second chance points in transition. And how did the Bulls get back in that game last night? They had, let me see how many they've had.
27.
It was a lot in transition, which is a product of the bad offense as much as defense.
Right.
28 fast break points last night, but also 16 second chance points. Orlando with that larger lineup had 18 second chance points in that game. Like those are high numbers, and I think that's one product of adding that size against the Wolves is you are then able to compete against them more on the glass and not just give up one shot and done, which is what you tend to do if you go smaller against the Wolves. So to me, I think that's a significant. I mean, and like you said, not every team's gonna have the personnel to be able to do this. But if you have somebody who's a good rebounder, put him out there. Try to steal a few more possessions.
It's when Jason and I were talking about it. It's like, can you take away, like, if you're the opposing coach, you ask yourself, like, does this take away more advantages from the Wolves than it creates disadvantages for us? And I thought the Orlando one was kind of the perfect example of that, because it was bringing in Isaac for Fultz. Gobert was on Fultz, which allows this advantage, right, of Gobert not being able to, or Gobert not needing to guard him, so he's at the rim all the time. That helps the defense a bunch. But that one was kind of a double whammy, because then Isaac could guard Cat, and Isaac could guard Cat, one-on-one. And what is one of the biggest advantages in the Wolves offense is playing out of double teams through Cat there. So you're right. There's totally different ways in which teams can do this, and different advantages they can take, disadvantages that they can create. I do feel, again, to pick into some of these blown late games, I think the Dallas, Boston, Oklahoma City, Charlotte, San Antonio, those first 5 of the 7, a lot of that was shooting themselves in the foot to me. I thought at least like Orlando and Chicago grabbed the gun and pointed it at the Wolves foot. You know what I'm saying? By doing
the guy from the meme. Yeah,
exactly. Yes, exactly. So I don't think this is, again, these blown late games are not all created equal. And I don't think these last 2 in particular are 100% on just the Wolves having a brain fart and, blowing the game. I think teams are doing things that are, inhibiting the execution that the Wolves need to play with.
Sure. Yeah, I would agree with that. It did feel like to your point, Chicago and Orlando did more to win the games, it felt like, than the Wolves.
Yes.
I mean, Charlotte and San Antonio, the Wolves just lost those games. Last night in Orlando was a combination of both. And it's especially, the old habits tend to creep up when you lose the focus, if you lose the intensity. And you could they've always been vulnerable to transition. They've always been a little vulnerable to offensive rebounding, or allowing offensive rebounding. And so when you're not minding what you're supposed to be doing, those are the first things that can go. And I think that's what we've seen in these games against Orlando and Chicago, is that, their demons come out, and we all know what the demons are. And it's no surprise when they show up. And I think the transition was what was also pretty stunning to me last night. Was this team has been really good. I mean, the Wolves have at getting minimizing it. And last night was really one of their worst games in transition all season. And that's really what got the Bulls and Coby White in particular jump started, was just the ability to score in transition.
Yeah, I want to talk about Coby because really, honestly, the way I think about a lot of this stuff is from the sense of, are these going to be issues that teams can use against them in the playoffs, right? Is this a really good idea to play 2 bigs against them and be on the offensive glass? Will that hurt them? Whatever it might be. And I thought another one, particularly late in the game, and granted, Coby White got rolling by playing in transition earlier in the second half, but a big part of the end of that game in the fourth quarter was the Bulls, and specifically Coby White, kind of incessantly hunting Karl Anthony Towns in pick and roll game, that's just something that's going to happen in the playoffs, not specific to Karl. A lot of teams will do that when they have particularly a guard that's rolling. They're just going to, they're going to call up the weakest defender out there to get in action and try and force that switch and let their rolling guard play against the least defensive option out there. And for the Wolves, when the other ones are Edwards, McDaniels, Gobert, and Conley, they're going to choose Karl Anthony Towns. And I think it's really important for this team to be able to execute better in that, sending the screener away from Karl's side, maybe pre-switching some of that sort of stuff. So you minimize the frequency with which Karl is involved in that action. I mean, Coby White had 30 points in the second half. Yeah. Actually, just in quarters 3 and 4, he didn't even score.
Right. He didn't score in overtime. Yeah.
In overtime. And you look at Vucevic had, I think he had 22 in 18 in the third and fourth quarter. I think he had 4 in overtime, so 22. Mm-hmm. And then DeRozan had 21 in the second half. And I'm thinking about that too. And it's like, all right, like it was Ant and Jaden guarding White and DeRozan, right? We're talking about the guys who need to, the younger players who need to think and be able to execute and not make those game plan mistakes. And then it was Karl on Vucevic, whether it was switching onto White or playing against Vucevic in the pick and pop game. And that was something that Finch, referenced in particular last night in his post game was, game plan mistakes. And he referenced the Vucevic stuff. So I say that to mean that's another specific, like the young players or the players who haven't had success in the playoffs on this team, not being able to, do what is required to be able to win the game when it's the last 5 minutes of the game, which is the time in the game that looks the most like the playoffs. And this is just something that for those 3 guys, they need to know that it's going to kind of rise or crumble based on, again, like Finch said, the focus and intensity just as much as it is about their execution.
And that was kind of one of the things I put in that piece was, I think, given the fact that those 3 are on the floor in such high pressure situations, it just the volatility of what can happen late in games, like, is high. It just is like, which version of these players are you going to get on a night in, night out basis, specifically in the playoffs?
Yep.
Now that I'm sure they anticipated this coming into the season too, but it'll be interesting to see how the Wolves try and respond to teams just hunting Karl late in games like that. Boston, I remember that game. That's all Boston's late game offense was try to get Karl switched on to Tatum and then attack. Mm-hmm. And it worked. So I wonder what the adjustments are. We saw Kyle Anderson come in for defense when they were able to call timeouts. So at least for the very end of possessions, you're able to get Karl off the floor, maybe for the last 1 or 2 when you have to call timeouts. But for the other preceding 4 or 5 minutes of crunch time defense, teams are starting to neutralize what the Wolves do best. So, we'll see what the coaching staff has to offer. I still try to keep a big picture in mind with this team, even amid these struggles, just because the arc of an NBA season is so long.
True.
And we have the All-Star break coming up here, which is a chance to pause and reset.
Yeah, this team needs it. Don't you just get
this
that
team,
vibe?
I think they really do need the All-Star break, and I think you really benefit them. And the schedule is an interesting schedule, but coming out of it, but but at least it's like they're not traveling like as much, like the hotel staff here is knocking at my door. They have those long kind of home stints and away stints, which I think will benefit them in the long run.
It's 7 games at home right out of the break.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, but it's like home, then away for a while, then back home for a while. So I actually think the schedule lays out nicely in terms of an energy standpoint for them. So they need the break. I think they need the break to refocus and come out. And it's kind of the thing of the NBA that teams really start to refocus and hunker down post All-Star break, kind of for that final sprint of the regular season. So I think the Wolves might be one of those teams who comes out with a renewed energy and sense of focus once they get a little break in about a week and a half here.
You mentioned Kyle Anderson in your answer as part of the answer for ways in which that teams can attack Karl Anthony Towns, which again, just because he's a power forward in a center's body or whatever, like teams late in games and in the playoffs are going to go at that. And for the Wolves, their like clear defensive reaction to that is putting Kyle Anderson into the game, who's for what he has lacked this season is very good at that. He's been a very good defensive player for this team, but that's coming with a cost too of whenever you put Kyle Anderson on the floor. Yes, your defense is going to get better. The numbers bear that out. But your offense is going to get substantially worse. And the numbers bear that out as well. Kyle also had the technical foul on the bench. Obviously, I didn't hear what was said, but, I'm talking to Finch and him after the game. It sounds like it was a quick trigger from the ref, whatever. It's these things adding up with Kyle Anderson, where last year he was their answer to problems. Yeah. And this year, when they try to use him to solve problems, he's creating new problems. Obviously we'll see what happens with the trade deadline tomorrow. I see a world where Kyle Anderson is on this team after the trade deadline, but I think we're getting to some sort of point with Anderson where, we were talking about earlier. Yeah. Okay. You're not going to close the game with Anthony Edwards off the floor, right? Or you're probably going to play Jaden McDaniels, whatever, all those guys. But when it is a bench player, your seventh, eighth man in Kyle Anderson, we might be getting to the point where something needs to change there, that it's not the same consistent minutes that he gets every time. If they do trade for, another player who's deserving of 15 to 20 minutes a night, well, then that player needs to be in the top 8 in the rotation. And Kyle Anderson's play, I'm not saying he needs to be banished from the rotation, but there's becoming, a case to be made that he maybe doesn't need to play every single night for this team, even though he provides somewhat of an answer for these defensive issues when teams are going at Karl Anthony Towns. I don't know, man. It's a tricky topic with Kyle Anderson, right? Like,
yeah, I come back to what happens, a couple times a game, watching these games, and it's like I don't think Kyle is as bad as or playing as bad as what the Twitter fan base was tweeting all through the game last night. As usual, I think there tends to be a little overreaction on social media. But I will say that sometimes it's a little hard to watch when the Wolves have an offensive possession and Kyle's in the corner and the ball swings to him. Yeah. And what would normally be an open look at 3 for anybody else, or for players that have been here in the past, like a Taurean Prince or Malik Beasley, the offense has generated an open look in the corner for somebody, but he just is reluctant to shoot it or doesn't want to, can't shoot it, whatever. And then he instead goes off the dribble, and it's like now you're trying to find another look on offense. You've already generated what should have been an open look. Yeah. But now you're trying to find it again. And I think that's where I kind of cringe and twinge when I'm watching kind of what the offense looks like in those Kyle minutes these days. It's just what should be an open look from 3 is not. And I think that hurts the offense as a whole.
I think there's a pretty basic way to think about the opportunity cost of that, right? Like the average corner 3-point shot in the NBA goes in 39% of the time. That's not the expectation with Kyle, obviously, but you think about that and you're like, well, if that was even a 33% proposition, right? That's the equivalent of about a point per possession, right? 3 times 0.33. And so then when Kyle goes off the dribble, abandons this, what should be a point per possession opportunity, and goes to the basket, and creates a shot. He needs to make that shot off the bounce at the basket at a 50% clip. And Kyle's actually somewhat pretty decent at that when he does get to it and get to the shot. And I think he can make that at a close to 50% clip. The issue, though, that's drives it down more, is he's also going to turn it over in those situations. Yeah. So even if it is, the pump fake and go to the basket when he gets the shot off is a 50% proposition, which it probably isn't, but whatever, we'll use round numbers here. Mm-hmm. It goes down because he's having turnovers out of there as well. Not to mention it like craters the whole spacing of the offense. And to that end, like we're creating too big of a negative proposition here that as good as his defense is, it does, it does not outweigh it there. And I think there's value in having Kyle Anderson on this team going forward, but if they don't trade him at the trade deadline and do get, one of the guys for a couple second round picks, it doesn't need to be Kyle has his 20-minute a night role a night until something else shakes out otherwise. In my opinion, this is just it seems like it's hurting more than it's helping when he's out on the floor.
I think last night too, and you look at the box score and it was like 1 for 2 with 1 turnover, so he wasn't even like that high of a usage, hardly at all. And what was it, 16 minutes, I think.
The minutes have gone down. We should note that it's not like Finch has just been like, okay, here, 5 minutes a night, no matter what. I've noticed that there's been some clearly, like he's down to what you and I were talking about, like who's the sixth man on this team last night when we were sitting there. We both kind of came to like, it's Nikhil, which Kyle's pretty clearly the 8th man on this team at this point in time.
Yeah, it's we'll see what happens at the deadline. And if that person ends up getting used, and it's like, it's obviously going to be more of a scoring, shooting type or backup point guard role. So they're thinking offense first with whatever player comes in here. And
whatever player it is that comes in here and they catch it in the corner, it's going to be the 33% proposition.
Yeah. Which is why I'm a little stunned that we don't at least get a little more run out of Troy Brown.
Sure.
Because I think Troy Brown will be, in a situation like that, shot ready and able to maybe knock down some of those open looks and he did earlier in the season when he was getting some time. So I wonder if there's more of this and more of those kind of struggles, does it cause Finch to even go a little more radical in terms of cutting Kyle's minutes, and especially if whatever acquisition comes in here kind of maybe fits in and boosts the bench offense a little more, because they need that right now. They had almost nothing from the bench last night in terms of scoring. It's so up and down right now with the bench production.
It seems like we're at a point where some sort of at least small shakeup needs to happen to the rotation or something. We talk about the late game offense, different guys playing. It's good that the deadline's tomorrow and that something can come out of that, because I think they need a spark either from a roster change or from Finch as not a huge we're not talking a huge rotation overhaul or anything like that, but I do believe there are at least a few small adjustments away from making this work. Chris, the last thing I do want to talk about, as this is, happening in a lot of these games that they've blown, is when the games fall apart in the fourth quarter, it's really overshadowing really good play in the first half. Obviously, the Charlotte game where Karl has 44 in the first half is the prime example of that. But specific to last night, the first half from both Ant and Karl was good. It was the rare both guys rolling at the same time. They had 41 points combined at halftime, 7 for 11 from 3, 6 for 11 from 2, 9 boards, 5 assists. And then I think they only had 22 points total in the second half and overtime combined. Specific to the Ant, that was a game, and for 2 games in a row, the Houston game and this one, where Ant again had extended stretches of looking like a superstar player. And while we've been nitpicking Ant in the clutch and things that he clearly has to do better there, I think there's an encouraging sign that at least these last 2 games, he's looked like that December, November version of himself, where it's like, okay, this is the best player on the floor. Doesn't dismiss a lot of the other stuff at the end of games, whatever. But there was a while there, for the last couple of weeks where Ant wasn't looking like this. And I just feel like we should note, it looks like Ant, at least individually, is kind of back. And unfortunately, being back means these high highs and these sort of dysfunctional lows at the end of the games, though I wouldn't put a ton of the end of game on him in this one. I thought that was more Jaden and Kat tonight. But Ant, just what Ant was able to do in the first half there. And in the fourth quarter, I thought he was really good at times too, making big defensive plays. And that I just want to acknowledge Ant's game. What stood out to you there?
Yeah, no, he that dominated that first half. I mean, that was a master class. His first half performance. I do think it circles back to kind of what we were talking about earlier, though. It's like, how often can you do this?
Yeah.
And that is the challenge, and reaching that potential, maintaining it throughout the course of a game, and just getting there on a night in, night out basis. That is the challenge for Anthony Edwards. It's putting a lot on his plate. It's asking a lot of him. But if you want to be a true superstar in this league, that's what you do. You play like he did in the first half on a more regular basis. You don't go through these lulls in the season. You don't go through lulls in a game, and you just keep your foot on the gas pedal. And, until your team's up by 30 plus. I don't know if it was what the Bulls were doing or Ant just, relaxing in the second half or whatever it was.
I think part of it was, we said before, he was trying to get others involved and allow space to do that.
Yeah, it was a different tenor coming out of the locker room than it was in the first half, when he was much more aggressive. And it was just a much more passive kind of second half. So if you can just bottle that and tell Ant, like, hey, even when we get up 20.
But Chris, what he's doing is that mentality, that aggression. I get it actually to some extent, because it's like a lot of when it is the high highs, like it was in the first half, and they're going in, it still looks like quote unquote hero ball at times.
That's true. That is true.
And so then it becomes the fourth quarter. You get a little bit of like the tingle, because you're like, okay, they've already cut this down to 10. And he's thinking about the film session, everything everyone said of like, it needs to not be hero ball at this time in the game. And so he's trying to control. I mean, he looked like a muted version of himself in the fourth quarter. I think with the right intentions, he's like, all right, this is what we talked about. We need me to do in this time to get others involved. But then he's not as involved in, again, at 20,
not as engaged.
Yeah, it's like he almost needs the hero ball sometimes to get himself going. That doesn't necessarily get the whole Wolves offense going, but I feel like just watching him, I'm seeing him wrestle with that. And then I think after the Orlando game and then after last night, it was a lot of like, what happened here? And his answers were, I don't know. A lot of, I don't know what the answers are here. And back in December at Christmas, when we were asking him those questions and they lose the game to Oklahoma City, whatever, what is his answers? I left too many bullets.
Right, exactly. I need to do more. Yeah.
So I think he doesn't know, because he's like, well, I guess that wasn't right. The bullets in the chamber thing.
It's a good point.
You know what I'm saying? We're like, he's somewhere in the confusion of that. And I don't think that's even an easy thing to answer, but it's made even harder when you're only 22 years old and inexperienced in the way that he is. But it's almost right away we were like, bullets in the chamber feels like an overcorrection. And then this is like I don't know.
Yeah, it's gone too far the other way in some ways.
And he's frustrated because of that.
Yeah.
And to be a star player and to be the all-star and best player he is on this team, a big part of whatever comes next, I think, is just mental and managing that frustration for Anthony Edwards. And there's been no signs of like real anger or finger pointing or anything like that, but you do see
he's working through it.
Yeah, you see him working through it, and you see the frustration, not necessarily in a negative way, but the frustration is here, and I just, that needs to be managed and needs to be, as a leader, kind of, I think, carried out through the team. I think this team needs a voice inside the locker room that is him. I just think it has to be him.
He's struggling with it, and I think I think back to like late game, quote unquote, hero ball possessions, and it's like it just seems like Ant predetermines sometimes. Okay, this is going to be a possession that ends with me shooting it one way or the other.
Yep.
Right. Whether it's a step back mid range, a three, or try to force something at the basket. It's like it just seems like whatever he kind of does in those situations is just predetermined, like what it's going to happen. Like he's not.
It reminds me of Wiggins, man.
This possession, he's maybe going to look for the guy in the corner, but other than that, he might be just, I'm so zoned in on trying to score here that I'm just going to do whatever I have to try to get a shot off, and that's obviously the NBA game and offense is so much reading and reacting and not predetermining what you're going to be doing. So again, this he's 22 years old, figuring it out in the league. This is what happens. This is what the growing pains are on display.
Yeah.
And when you have the pressure to win now, when you're in a 4-way tie for first place on the Western Conference, this is the margin between getting that 1 seed and maybe dropping a 4.
Yeah.
At this point is a young player trying to just figure out his best course of action and navigating these high pressure situations when this team needs him to do it.
Yeah. I said Wiggins in there for a second. I don't mean to compare Anthony Edwards to Andrew Wiggins, but from my experience of covering this team, I remember Wig early in his career having a lot of that predetermination of what he was going to do. You kind of was like, all right, I'm in this spot. It's X, Y, Z. It doesn't really matter what the defense is going to do. I'm going to do that. And I think that is a very common thing for somebody in their early 20s of their way to approach, the late game situations or anything when their team needs them is very, very predetermined. And that is something I think Wiggins as an example that comes with time, particularly when, like Wiggins and like Edwards, you're supremely athletic, where if you do just do X, Y, and Z, you're probably going to get to a good look, or you're just going to be able to rise, not a good look, but you're going to be able to get to a look there. And so, it's just, and this ties back to the whole beginning, probably a place to wrap. It's ultimately about how fast is this going to happen? Anthony Edwards is going to be a star in this league, and he's going to figure this out. The question is, for this, is he going to figure it out in 2 months, or is he going to figure it out in 2 years? And for this season, if it's going to be this season, obviously it needs to happen in the next 2 months. And I don't pretend to say that this is an easy thing for him to solve. But I think the season kind of goes with how much he is able to solve this or not, whether it's drops them down in the standings or costs them in execution in the playoffs. A lot of it is on Ant. Some of that's unfair, but a lot of it is fair. You're the max player. You're an all-star, 2-time all-star now. Maybe to make all NBA, like, congratulations for doing it at 22 years old. It does come with some added expectations surrounding it. And, we'll see what the timeline for being able to figure it out is. It just feels like that's kind of where we're stuck. Right now.
That's it. It'll benefit him long term, but in the short term, it's you're going to have these moments.
Which is so interesting. It's like, again, to the Gobert trade, we think this is going to benefit Ant, and they're not wrong. I think this is benefiting Ant.
There are ways that it does, absolutely. But
it's just woo.
Yeah,
still a gamble, baby. It's still that was a big bet, and it's broadly paid dividends this season. But it's times like this where it makes you go, this was a wager. I would, and that's what your piece was out on. Again, on Sunday before this Bulls game, you'd picked up on this trend and wanted to dig into it. I think particularly the Ant and Jaden element of it, given how young they are, was a smart thing to dig into there. Chris's article You can look that up on the Star Tribune in the Sunday paper, and it's titled "Are Timberwolves Asking Too Much of Their Young Players at This Point in Their Careers?" And it's a great question that Chris laid it out there for. But we don't know. We don't know the
Right.
answer to that. We will we'll that will be results oriented.
We'll find out.
Is how it all to be determined. All right, let's drive to Milwaukee.
Yes, let's do it. Dane, you could tell the luxurious hotel decor. Dane is in a Courtyard Marriott, and I am in a Fairfield Inn, and we're literally half a block away from each other.
We are. Yes, me, John, and Chris are
the luxury of the road.
Yes, loading up in my car, and
That's right.
We are driving to Milwaukee here. I should say, I guess there will probably be a trade between from when me and Chris stop recording right now and into the next episode. I'm going to be in Milwaukee when the trade deadline happens. The trade deadline is going to happen a couple hours before the Wolves game against the Bucks. So my reaction to whatever happens at the trade deadline will be on Friday morning with Britt. We'll talk about whatever does or doesn't happen at the deadline, and we'll talk about that Bucks game, which I think is getting overshadowed because it's on the same day as the trade deadline. I think that's a really interesting basketball game.
See if Dame plays. He sat out last night. So
yes.
Check his status.
That would be helpful. Even though, and I wouldn't mind seeing him play them at full strength either. But yep, that's what's coming up. Bucks game trade deadline. Brett and I will get to that on Friday morning. So that'll probably be out early afternoon on Friday. Chris, appreciate you waking up and doing an early morning pod here with me in Chicago. And we'll chat again in my car in like 30 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah.
We'll be back on the pod sometime next week as well. We'll both be in Portland, so we'll make something there happen, maybe with Kyle too. So until then, he's Chris. You're following him on Twitter at Christopher Hine. Wrote that piece in Sunday's paper on Ant and Jaden. Also, I haven't read it yet because I think it just came out this morning. Has a trade deadline piece up there as well, so check that out this afternoon or on Thursday before the deadline as well. Until Friday with Britt, he's Chris, I'm Dane. Peace out.
How I'm feeling, man, I hope it never stop, yeah. Green and hot so you can find me in the crowd, yeah. Don't let standards ever bring you down, yeah.